us his new book, In Search of Israel, The History of an Idea. And the idea is the debates and discussions over the past 130 years or so, since the late 19th century, on what political form of organization the Jewish people should one day take, if any at all. And I found this to be really interesting. There's so many ideas and possibilities and alternatives to the situation that we see today that were debated and discussed for a very long time. And so the first question that I wanted to ask you is the way that you open up the book. You open the book with this really interesting anecdote in which someone is asking a prominent Jewish intellectual, saying, you guys are such a unique people. You're such a unique, special people with this unique history and whatnot. Why do you want to give it up to become a country like Albania? Albania is not a country you usually think about too much when you think about the history of Jewish people. Why did the idea of becoming a country like Albania exert an appeal?
Yeah, and it's interesting. Actually, Albania appears and reappears again in those discussions in the 1920s and 30s of what the Jewish state should become. The person who is asked the question is Chaim Weizmann, who was the leader of the Zionist movement and later the first president of the State of Israel. Mm-hmm. And as the story goes, told by Isaiah Berlin, important Oxford philosopher, the lady who asked him the question, as you say, she said, but you just want to be a country like Albania? And supposedly Weizmann's head lit up like a light bulb, and he said, Albania, yes, Albania. And why Albania? Well, I guess the idea was Albania was a relatively new and relatively small state, which most of the world didn't care that much about. And one of the central wishes of some of the Zionist leaders was, we just want to be a people like any other people, in a state like any other state, if there is anything like that, because Jews were always the other. We're always so special, and we don't want to be singled out. We just want to live a normal life.
Right, to be a state like any other. And Albania is sort of the quintessential state like any other. It's not the other.
Exactly,
right?
Exactly.
One of the things that you were talking about in here is the ways in which, most states will think of themselves as unique in some respect. And part of the appeal of becoming a state like Albania was to be a little less unique, sort of in one respect. And part of the irony of what eventually happens with the creation of Israel is that Israel, as you suggest, becomes truly unique in the sense that it is not only perceived as unique by the people who live within that country, but it's also perceived as unique by everyone else, right? Why is this unique to Israel? Why is it that Israel has this distinction where, in addition to every single state, the leader is always thinking, oh, we're special. Everyone else also thinks it's special.
Right. So you're absolutely right. I mean, these ideas of uniqueness are all over, and we see them in America and in many European countries and other places. But interestingly, very often they are even... The idea of uniqueness often is based on a model of a chosen nation, which again is based on the biblical story, and it's again the Jewish story. So in that case, I would say it's almost a prototypical case of uniqueness. So that makes it a little different. In addition, I think it is a different story of establishing a country. It's not a country that the State of Israel established in 1948. There was no Jewish state for almost 2,000 years, and there are probably no parallels to a nation that, at least in its own consciousness, regards itself as a successor of a state that had existed 2,000 years ago. Right. And at the same time, I would say the other part was the very immediate past, and that's of course the Holocaust as part of the foundational story of Israel, which was also seen obviously as a very unique crime and genocide in modern history. So Jews who wanted to escape that uniqueness were almost thrown back into it by the terrible acts that happened to them just a few years before the state was founded. So they're kind of trapped in this uniqueness.
Right. That's actually an interesting way of putting it, trapped in this uniqueness. One of the things that occurred to me as I was reading your book when you were talking about this is the ways in which part of what makes Israel so unique is not necessarily just its perception by other people, but the specific geopolitical circumstances that lead up to its creation. And you talk about many other alternatives that were posited as to what other forms that the Jewish people might be able to take in a political organization, a state, or a permanent diaspora, something like this. So let me ask you, was Israel the ideal solution from the perspective of, can you talk about the most prominent Jewish thinkers or leaders? Was there any sort of consensus? Because Israel was in large degree determined by outsiders, the strategic interests of other parties. Was it the ideal solution in hindsight?
It's hard to say if the leaders who thought about it 120 years ago would say this is the ideal state. Probably, we can, depending on where we stand, we could say yes or no.
Right.
But if you go back to the beginnings of the idea of a modern Jewish state, so the story of political Zionism, which really started in the 1890s with Viennese journalist called Theodor Herzl, who wrote a book called The Jewish State. You see how many questions are still open because there is no immediate example. He wanted to create a state because Herzl and other early Zionists thought there is so much anti-Semitism, especially in Eastern Europe, but also other parts of Europe, that Jews need their own state, and especially if they want to be a nation like any other nation, they need to have a state like any other nation has it. But the question, where should it be? For Herzl, in the Jewish state, he says, Palestine or Argentina. There's not much in the Bible about Argentina, but Argentina was a country that invited many immigrants at the time and was considered fertile territory and a good place to go to. Later, the British consider offering the Zionists Uganda, East Africa, is actually today's Kenya, a part of it. And he says, well, why not? We could at least consider this. And then there are other territory. Then there's a small segment of the Zionist movement that splits, and they call themselves the territorialists, and they would consider any territory in Australia, in South America, wherever it is, to save the Jewish people of Europe. So the question where wasn't clear. The question, should it be an independent state or maybe an autonomous entity within, back then was the Ottoman Empire, or later within Britain? That wasn't clear either. What kind of constitution should it have? Should it be a secular state or a more religious state? Most of the founders of Zionism and the State of Israel were secular, and actually many of them were socialists, so they didn't want a religious state, but there were religious Jews and then there were other Jews who didn't want to have a Jewish state at all, because they said, but we are Jews because our religion is Jewish, so why do we need a state? And others said, we're Jews because our nationality is Jewish, we're part of the Jewish people. So Jews couldn't even agree if they're a religion or a nation. And if you're only religion and not a nation, you usually don't want to have your own state. So there were a lot of disagreements, and I would say it was really only during World War II that the majority of Jews, the background of course is the Holocaust, the catastrophe, that the majority of Jews see, we actually need a state. Even if we don't want to live there, but other Jews want to live there, but we need a Jewish state.
It's important for the Jewish people to have this political emblem of stability, this anchor in the world of nation states, even if I'm not going to live there.
If, we had it in 1935, maybe not 6 million, but some millions maybe could have been saved in the Holocaust. So that was the number one. But at the same time, I wouldn't say it was the Holocaust that created the State of Israel, because even before the Holocaust, the Zionist movement had some considerable diplomatic successes and immigration to Palestine.
I think what's so wonderful about the book is how you bring out this complexity. For someone like me, not a specialist in this area and whatnot, it's easy to sort of passively fall into the habit of thinking of the Jewish people as, this homogenous group, and it's, oh yeah, the Jewish people, I understand what you're talking about. And when you read this, you very quickly understand how complicated it is, how many internal schisms there are. And I found your discussion of the history of Israel since the creation of the state in 1948 also to be really interesting. I mean, for the first 25 years or so, the type of people who immigrate there, their educational level, their degree of secularism, or whatnot, changes drastically over several generations. And one of the major distinctions that we see today is this distinction between the Israeli diaspora and the Jewish diaspora.
Right.
And so this will be the last question that I kind of wanted to pose to you. It's not splitting hairs to try and ask what is the difference between the two.
Right. So when the first Zionist thinkers conceived of the Jewish state, their ideal was that all the Jews would gather in this future Jewish state. They would all live there. Then, of course, you had some Zionists who realized, well, probably American Jews won't go there, but most others might go there, but there will be a Jewish diaspora that will remain. And today we have almost ironic situation. We don't have only the Jewish diaspora plus the state of Israel, but we have also an Israeli diaspora.
Right.
And in a way, and that's my argument, in contrast to maybe the prevailing opinion in Israel for many decades, which saw the Israeli immigrants, in a very negative light. Actually, the Hebrew term is yordim, those who descend, who go down, as opposed to those who immigrate to Israel, who go up.
Right.
So I argue that is one achievement of normality.
Right.
The number, the percentage-wise, the Israeli citizens who leave the state of Israel is comparable to most Western countries. It's not outrageously huge. That's a normal feature of most countries, that people come in and other people go out. That's the natural situation, especially in the 21st century. So many of these Israelis, even of the second generation, maintain the language Hebrew, maintain relations with Israel. And for those who live in Europe, Berlin, surprisingly, now has one of the largest Jewish expat communities. It's so close that they go back and forth. I mean, it's a flight like from New York to Miami, if you fly from Berlin to Tel Aviv, and they live in both worlds very often. And I think this is, in a way, a new normal, not for the average person, but for many people. In that way, I would argue the Israeli diaspora lends even a little bit of normality to the state.
Right. That's a really interesting way of thinking about it, that to be a normal state, to have this sense of normality, you need a political expatriate community, where the very definition that they're expatriate comes from the fact that I have a political identity of being associated with Israel, and not just a cultural or religious identity.
It would make it a non-normal state if Israel would not have any Israeli community outside the country.
Right, absolutely. Well, I certainly learned a lot from your book, and I think it's essential reading for people who are interested in understanding what is truly one of the most pressing issues of the day. As you say, Israel, the Jewish community, occupies a proportion of public discourse and debate far out of proportion to its actual population, the size of Israel, any of these indicators. So thank you very much for sitting down with me today.
Thank you.